All right. So should we get started, Praveen?
Yes, thank you.
Welcome, everybody, to the Spring 2021 World Affairs Lecture. This is an event that's sponsored by the Social Sciences Department in collaboration with the Presidential Scholars Program. But really, all the kudos goes to Professor Praveen Chaudhry, who does all the work for the event, and Professor Emre Osos, who is really our WebEx master for the event. Thank you to everybody for being here. We know there are so many competing events going on at FIT right now, so we really appreciate that you took the time to join us for this important discussion that we are going to host this afternoon. My role is, I'm Professor Yasmin Çelik-Levine, and I am a professor of political science here at FIT, for those of you who don't know me. And I'm also the director of the Presidential Scholars Program. And my job today is to introduce our two speakers. Souzeina Mushtaq is an educator and a photographer based in New York City. Her research focuses on queer Muslim women and their intersecting identities. She has also been collaborating on a visual ethnography project on nomads and weavers of the Himalayas in Kashmir and Tibet, and yureks of the Taurus Mountains in Turkey for the past 7 years. Souzeina currently teaches journalism at the University of Wisconsin, River Falls. Our other speaker today is Busra Erkara. She's an Istanbul-based writer and editor. She writes about politics and culture in Turkey with a focus on individual histories and her personal experiences. Her work has been published in ID, Vice, the New York Times, and she previously appeared on one of the BBC World Service's shows, The Conversation. A former editor of Bullet and Nylon magazines, Busra currently leads the editorial department at OMM, Odunpazarı Modern Museum, a contemporary art museum in Turkey. She also has a bi-weekly newsletter called Tuto, available in Turkish. And we will be happy to share those links with you later in the day. Thank you so much. And I turn the virtual floor over to Souzeina.
Thank you, Professor Çelik-Levine, for the introduction. Thank you to the organizers of the World Affairs Lecture for inviting me. I'm excited to be here to talk to Busra, whose work I have been following over the years. I first went to Istanbul in 2014, simply out of my love for Orhan Pamuk. I wanted to experience the city he so lovingly writes about in his books. I wanted to experience the city's huzn, and needless to say, I fell in love. So much in love that for the next few years I came back, not only to Istanbul, but to other parts of Turkey as well. My next visit was in 2015, when I went to Ankara, Turkey's capital, to present my paper on transgender people at one of the best universities, ODTÜ, also known in English as METU, Middle Eastern Technical University. On the day of my presentation, 2 bombs were detonated outside Ankara Central Railway Station. Around 109 people were killed in those bombings. I was 13 minutes away from the bombing site. And just a day before the bombings, I was at the Ankara Central Railway Station, having traveled from Istanbul. Those bombings introduced me to the deeper issue of the Turkish-Kurdish conflict and the student political movements who have been at the forefront of speaking against the state and mainly bearing the brunt. In July 2016, few days after the bloodiest coup, I landed in Turkey again. The journalist in me was curious to know and understand what was happening. Together with my partner and a Turkish friend, we set out and drove around 2,000 miles in Turkey, talking to people. At this time, I realized my Turkish friend identified as queer, bisexual to be precise. My research is about queer Muslim women and their intersecting identities. Knowing my research interest, my friend introduced me to the queer scene in Turkey. My conversations with this friend, a staunch student activist herself, a self-identified queer person who was raised in a Muslim household, led me into the deeper circle of LGBTQ politics in Turkey and the problems they face as women. So when I was invited to this seminar to have a conversation with Busra, who has written extensively about women issues and LGBTQ people in Turkey, I was thrilled. Without further ado, I welcome Busra Erkara, who will be speaking about women's agency and murders in Turkey today. Busra will speak for 35 to 40 minutes, and then she and I will discuss some of the issues raised in the presentation. And after that, we'll open the talk for questions from the public. Three of our best students, Abigail, Andy, and Sydney, will be looking at the questions. So please type your questions in Q&A window next to the chat. Hoş geldin, Busra.
Hoş bulduk. Thank you so much for the beautiful introduction. I'd like to thank Praveen, Yasemin, and FIT's Department of Social Sciences for inviting me, Souzeina for hosting, Emre for organizing, and Andy, Abigail, and Sydney for moderating. I'd like to also say thank you to Nancy Atakan, who very kindly allowed us to use one of her artworks for the poster of this lecture. And unlike my friends who are academics, after more than a year in lockdown, I've practically forgotten how to speak, so best of luck to all of us. Like Yasemin mentioned, I was based in New York for many years before moving back to Istanbul in 2018. And in the years I lived in New York, for most of them, I actually worked right down the street from FIT on 27th between 6th and 7th for a magazine called Bullet. I later became an arts and culture editor at Nylon. And after I came back to Turkey, the Women's Night March, which is where this photo was taken on March 8th of the year, has become my favorite night of the year and favorite community to be a part of. It pretty much looks like this, and this year 30,000 women walked on Women's Night March. Today I'll try to talk a little bit about why you see Turkish women protesting on the streets as often as they do, and why so many women walk at Women's Night March. This is another image that I took at another Women's March. That was New York in 2017. And the two instances are organically connected in my head because I feel that when Trump was elected in 2016, and executive orders started coming left and right, and there was a lot of backpedaling on what you would consider very fundamental human rights and going back on reproductive rights. I feel like people who lived in Turkey instantly felt like they knew the script because this is the kind of governance they lived with under President Erdogan's regime, at least for the last 10 years. This is an image that was taken less than a month ago. This is on the day after the current president announced that Turkey would be withdrawing from the Istanbul Convention, which we see as the most reliable legal pillar to protect Turkish women, protect women all around the world, really. And it's also an image to me that symbolizes how anti-democratic and authoritarian Turkey grew with each year I wasn't living here. And that authoritarianism shows itself the most in how hostile the state has been in the face of women and LGBTQ community. Back when I lived in New York, I actually did not set out to write about politics or Turkey, but the shifts that were going on back home were so intense that I found myself just having to write about them. On the left-hand corner is an article from 2013 from around the time of Gezi Park protests, which was a protest that was first of its kind in Turkey. It started as a sit-in for environmental rights and then became an instance where people were speaking up against the growing authoritarianism. It lasted for 20 days and only ended after 11 protesters were murdered by the police and at least 8,000 were injured. In the middle is an article I penned for Vice after the night of the failed coup that Souzeina was talking about. And the violence and the shock was so intense that I felt like I simply had to write about it. I didn't know what else to do with it. And on the right-hand corner, there's an article I wrote for the New York Times after I returned home in the winter that followed the coup. And I was very surprised to see the entire Istanbul in the form of a billboard for government propaganda. And when I say Istanbul, I feel like New York is somewhat small in comparison to Istanbul. Istanbul is more like a Sao Paulo or a Los Angeles in terms of how wide it grows. So I came back home in 2018, and I feel like it was a time when things were already falling apart. By the time I came back, Turkey had jailed some of its most valuable academics over their ask of peace. And actually right now, as I speak, there are many jailed academics, journalists, and intellectuals just based on their political stance. The Turkey I returned to was definitely on the brink of an economic crisis. And I feel like at this time, it's in the depths of an economic crisis. And then women's murders, femicides were already growing very high in numbers. And there was a spike in violence against women. And women had already started taking onto streets to protest this violence. So on the left is an image from the protests after the murder of Özgecan Aslan. And I remember her vividly because this was the first time I read about the news and I felt like I had to talk or write about the rising femicides in Turkey. And between that day and today, and this number is probably incomplete, but 1,962 more women were murdered. And there is no way of comparing tragedies, but just to give you an idea of what that number entails, that's actually 1,000 people shy of the number of people who died in 9/11. This is an image from a theater in Ankara where the theater company used victims of femicides to measure social distancing. And it's the closest thing you'll see to a mass graveyard, I feel, for these women. And when Praveen, Souzeina, and I first started talking about this lecture last winter, I feel like it was a subject of critical importance, but in the wake of the president's ask to withdraw from the Istanbul Convention, it's even more critical because 9 women were murdered in the 9 days that followed the announcement of this decision. And we do expect that the numbers might be higher than ever in the current political climate and with the current rhetoric. One place that's good to start is to look into the word femicide and why we call it femicides. So World Health Organization defines femicides as murders of women by men because they're women. And it's really more about gender than it's about sex, first of all. And it also makes me think of this phrase that the newscasters use usually when defining these murders, because they'll say, so-and-so killed their wife in a fit of rage, or so-and-so killed their mother in a fit of rage. I feel like in that phrase, in a fit of rage, the word femicide is hidden, because compared to the 400-something women murdered in a fit of rage each year, there are very few men, very few male colleagues, male friends, male bosses who are murdered. One thing that's important about the word femicide also is this was a word that the state wouldn't use up until a few years ago. And it was through the action of women's organizations that the Ministry of Interior now uses the word femicide. On the right-hand side is another clipping that really touched my heart, where it reads, "They are hunted like birds here." So women are murdered in Turkey because they're seen as weak and because they do not get the protection they should be getting when they ask for it. There are multiple women's organizations in Turkey who I feel we're endlessly indebted to. They work in the field. They show up for each and every trial, which is kind of never-ending Promethean work, I would say. But one of them is this platform called We Will Stop Femicides platform that was founded in 2010 after yet another femicide. And actually, the Turkish state doesn't keep statistics on femicides. So it is the We Will Stop Femicides platform who keeps and uses these stats. And I'll be using a lot of their data in this presentation. But when you look at this graph that's showing the years 2008 to 2019, you'll see that the number of femicides just doubles, triples, quadruples, with the exception of a single year. That is 2011, and that was the year when Turkey was a part of the Istanbul Convention, which is an international treaty to prevent violence against women. And it was also a year when a lot of male politicians were on mainstream media talking about how violence against women were bad, the murders weren't supposed to happen, and the fact that Turkey was signing the Istanbul Convention was a good thing. So let's keep this one in mind. I have a few cases that I remembered instantly when working on this lecture. One of them is the case of Özgecan Aslan, whose photo you've seen in previous slides. And the case of Özgecan, she was murdered by a stranger after he attempted to rape her. And this case is important because it was the first time actually women went out on the streets in the numbers that they do now. And I feel like they have been going out on streets ever since, which is a heartbreaking but good change. And when you Google Özgecan's name, as when you Google the names of all these other women that come up, you'll get like hundreds of more names, which is a very devastating Google search result to look at. There's the murder of Hande Kader that I also remembered instantly. Hande was an activist, so a lot of people who protested in Istanbul would know her face immediately. Her body was found in an upscale residential area of Istanbul, and while we know that there was more than one murderer. To this date, we don't know who they were. There is the murder of Şule Çet, whose case is also of great importance for a few different things. One is when it first opened, it was a suicide case because the murderer tried to give the illusion of suicide. The other is the murderer's father had close ties to the government, so the case was kind of not moving at certain points. And it was actually women protesting on the streets and the pressure from social media that kind of kept a clear, just investigation going. There is the murder of Emine Bulut, which is a very common storyline in these hundreds of murders. But Emine was about to get a divorce from her husband. She had filed for a divorce. And a few hours before being killed, she actually went to the police station to ask for protection, and she wasn't given it immediately. And she was simply killed only 2 hours later. And this is the type of murder that we will see the most in Turkey, unfortunately. There is the murder of Pınar Gültekin, whose case is still open. Also, some things to note about this femicide. The murderer claimed to be Pınar's ex-boyfriend, and the murderer was married. So in the public eye, I feel that she was instantly less favorable, or it was a less sympathetic story. And then it was actually through the work of 2 journalists writing for The Guardian that it turns out he was a stalker. He met Pınar once. And now he claims that he was being usurped for money by Pınar. So, and we know whose side the state tends to be on in cases like this. Another thing that I found interesting, like looking at these cases, is there is always an accomplice who shows up to hide the body, and it's a lot of the times it's other men. It's always a male friend. It's always a male colleague. But in Pınar's murder, it was the murderer's entire family helping him out. You may remember this hashtag and this campaign last summer. And while you may not know about it, this actually started right after Pınar's death. And it basically echoes the photos of women that are posted after they're murdered, because they're always full of light, but they're always in black and white, and the women in the pictures are no longer among us. There is the murder of Fatma Altinmakas, which took place around the time of Pınar's murder. And there's also an important storyline here, as Fatma was being systematically raped by her brother-in-law with death threats. And when she spoke to her own family about this, they advised her to go to the police. She went to the police with her husband, but her first language is Kurdish, and she wasn't appointed a translator, which resulted in an incomplete testimony. So the brother-in-law was released 2 days later, and Fatma was killed by her husband on the day the brother-in-law was released. And then there are women who are still missing, like Gülistan, who was last seen on January 5. And the main suspect is her boyfriend. And her boyfriend's stepfather works at the local police station who was following the case. So there is negligent investigation, there is missing evidence, and incidentally, Gülistan is still missing. This is a project that I'm both in awe of and wish that never had to exist. It's called the Monument Counter, and it's a digital monument to all women who were victims of femicides. And in the Turkish version of this, when you click on the name, you'll get the news story, and you can also see whether the woman in question asked for protection from the state or not. I had taken a screenshot on April 3rd, and the number for this year at the time was 88. And by the time, 2 days ago, April 13 came in, I actually saw that 28 more women were killed. These numbers should not be looked at as numbers, really. So a valid question is what's driving the femicide rates? And the answer is at least two-pronged. I would say there is definitely the misogynistic rhetoric. Those in power often speak of women in really unbelievable ways. And there's the continued impunity, which I will talk a little bit about in the following slides. But men know that they can do anything and they will find a way to get away, because this has been the state policy for many years now. And last of all, women get murdered when they make a decision for themselves. So statistically, the femicides take place the most when women make up their mind about something like getting a divorce or getting a job or making a decision for their children, and it's not approved by the men. Here's another graph by the We Will Stop Femicide platform, and it asks the question, who killed women? And this is data from 2020, and with 32%, it was the husband. With 18%, it was the current partner, followed by 13% a male acquaintance, 8% unidentified, 7% former husband, and then the list goes on with son, father, relative, former partner, brother, and someone they do not know. And then there are the pretexts for men murdering women. And I feel like this slide circles back on where we began and also what we are talking about just now. Because with 21% other and 20% unknown, I feel like it's self-evident, self-explanatory that these women are murdered because they are women. But then that's followed by debate and fighting, asking for a divorce, rejecting a man's demand for making up, or jealousy. I've already brought up the Istanbul Convention a few times at this point, but it would be good to talk a little bit more about it. The complete name for this convention is the Convention on Preventing and Combating Violence Against Women and Domestic Violence. It was prepared by a number of countries, the majority of whom are EU countries, where the domestic violence rates are also very high. And Turkey was its first signatory and also worked on the legal nooks, the laws that went into the convention. But it's important because, first of all, the convention wants to create a society that prevents. What does that mean? A femicide is the highest, kind of the peak point of violence against women. Before it's murder, there are many steps kind of leading up to the murder. So the convention wants to create a society that stops violence in its track before it turns into femicides. It protects women and also men at all costs when they file a complaint or go to authority. It ensures that there's an effective investigation, that the justice is provided. And last of all, it has a lot of emphasis on strengthening women's role in the society in terms of all, all the things that the convention looks into is born of gender inequality. So the convention actually wants to create a society where there is gender equality. A few more things here, but it's very much based on human rights. It asks that authorities respond whether the victim of violence sues or not, because a lot of times someone who's in the receiving end of the violence may not sue for fear of retaliation. It prevents women from becoming victims for a second time at the police station. It educates doctors, counselors, and those who hurt women, as well as, children in primary education. It doesn't discriminate based on gender or orientation, and it protects children under all circumstances. So you may look at this and think, why would anyone withdraw from this? It looks great. So the president cited that the convention's content and various practices have created sensitivity in the public opinion and caused criticism. What's implied here is the news that mostly kind of from state-owned media saying that the convention would encourage people to become gay, or that it would destroy families, make men weaker and like no longer the kind of head of the house. And this isn't an uncommon narrative. Turkey is not the first country where these claims surfaced. It's usually the case for any religious group or kind of any extreme traditionalist groups to kind of claim. One thing that is a bit lighter is that actually the public doesn't approve withdrawing from the convention. So at this point, it's still with 52.3% of people not wanting to withdraw from the convention. It's really one man's decision. And we think the convention is still in place. So the government does claim to do certain things to prevent women from being murdered and, provide justice for the thousands of women who already have. And what they do really is, when they propose laws, the focus is very much on the family and at best motherhood, but never on women's lives. In the latest National Action Plan, there was no mention of the Istanbul Convention, which really puzzled the, feminist lawmakers. But then once a month ago, the president announced that there would be no more convention, it made sense. And then most recently, the word gender has been removed from all educational materials. This is from a story Beryl Eski wrote, but about 56,000 women applied for state protection in 2016, and 10,000 of them were provided shelter. The government doesn't really have the structure in place to respond to each and every one of these protection requests. There is a ridiculous practice called suit and tie reduction, in which you could commit any crime, show up in a suit and tie, and you will get 5 to 10 years of reduced sentence based on good behavior because you're wearing a suit and tie. And actually, you'll get even further reduction if you show remorse. You say that like you regret what you did, or if you claim that the victim provoked you. So this, as sad as it is, this happens in Turkey every single day. There's the case of Pippa Bacca, which I remember from being younger, but Pippa Bacca was an Italian artist who was hitchhiking around the world with a project called Brides of Peace. And she was raped and murdered in Turkey brutally. Her murderer was given lifetime in prison, but then somehow that sentence has been reduced to 30 years. And you cannot look at a case like this and see any reason why that sentence could ever be reduced. But this is the current judicial system in Turkey, and these reductions take place every day, including men sexually assaulting their own children. Actually, a lot of men do go back to the homes where the children still live. There's the subject of electronic cuffs, which there's a very big student protests going on in Istanbul right now. And in the last 3 months, 40 students were immediately made to wear these electronic cuffs because they participated in the protests. And back in 2015, the parliament said they would use these cuffs on men who are potential perpetrators. And to this day, in Istanbul, which is a city of almost 18 million, only 5 men were made to wear the electronic cuff. So we know very well that the state can know who is doing what where. They just prefer not to when it comes to murderous men. These images may be a little triggering to some, and especially if you live in Turkey, but on the left is a female student being taken into custody from the current protests I told you about. And on the right is members of the LGBTQIA community being taken into custody by force again. Not all Turkish politicians are as oblivious to this. There are some people, especially women, who try to change the laws for the better and who want to make sure that the Istanbul Convention stays in effect and it gets implemented. But I'll send you a video of this. But actually, the cabinet members performed the Tesis song at the Turkish parliament about 2 years ago, and it was a very puzzling moment for me, because you look at the woman on the left and think, when you cannot find justice in courts, you have to go out on the squares and protest like this. But then in Turkey, the cabinet members have to do it in the parliament, which is, I feel, telling in and of itself. Also a recent image showing a giant petition on a building, but this is often the type of petition that women file to receive protection, and because they almost never do, when they're murdered, they're found with these petitions in their bags. This ad was immediately taken down, I believe within like 7 or 8 hours, but it's being posted on windows, and just today I saw it like hanging from the Bosphorus Bridge, so it's still going around. Now, I know this wasn't the most pleasant subject, and you may, if you listen to this and thought, oh, I'm so lucky not to be a woman in Turkey right now, or I'm so sad for these women, I have bad news for you, because I feel that the source of this is patriarchy, and none of us are really free from it. I'm only talking about Turkey today, but you look at Europe and you look at the US, and you'll find similar cases and similar numbers. So for this reason alone, none of us can be saviors, even if we wanted to. Korean director Bong Joon-ho said this about the Parasite. This was before the film received an Oscar, but he was truly surprised to see that it got as much attention as it did, because he said, I thought I was making a film about the class system in Korea, but then I forgot that we all live in the same country now, and it's called capitalism. I'd like to add patriarchy to that. I feel like we all live in a country called capitalism and patriarchy. However, international awareness does make a difference. So I do kindly ask you to, when the Pride Month comes in on June, I do ask you to keep an eye on the Turkeys of the world and the Polands of the world and the Russias of the world, but also the Georgias of the world and Winnipegs of the world. Like I mentioned, the Feminist Night March is my favorite place to be in Istanbul, and you'll see these really amazing banners. One personal favorite is, if you fear from the dark at night, we will set the city on fire. There is the You Will Never Walk Alone, which is an appropriation from the Liverpool fans. There is the They Tried to Bury Us, but we were the seeds. There is my personal favorite, I'll dismantle the patriarchy, you do the dishes. I'll look back to where I started. Well, another one is, if you ever lose hope, remember this crowd. But to go back to where I started, what gives me hope and strength really is that in the 3 years that I've been back here, I've never met a hopeless feminist. So I do know that we have to stay out on the streets and work on this until there are better days ahead. Praveen will kindly send you a few links after the class that I think would be great additional resources, but thank you so much for being here. We're strong together.
Thank you so much, Busra, for this thought-provoking and this powerful, powerful talk. Do you mind if you stop sharing the screen so we can just have a little conversation? Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I'm still trying to wrap my head around all these important issues that you raised in your presentation. And I know we don't have much time because I want to open the discussion, to the public for their questions. But there are a couple of things that I wanted to sort of bring about, because you mentioned Istanbul Convention, right? And it certainly is essential and much needed, since it protects women from any kind of violence, basically, right? And not only that, it also helps prosecute the offenders, right? But in your presentation, you talked about how family or accomplices of these murderers are somehow connected to the government, right? So, I mean, there's no doubt that the convention became a political battleground, with supporters of the state who clearly have no interest in protecting women, claiming that it erodes family values, right? As you mentioned, that state does not keep any statistics for female femicide rates in Turkey, right? And I was just thinking, like, the way you talked about how this convention was used against LGBTQ people as well, right? Alleging that queerness makes men weak. I found it interesting because in my own research about queer Muslim women, I found that female homosexuality is condemned and unacknowledged because of the patriarchy in the system, right? Because it basically shakes the foundation of this phallocentric misogyny, it shatters the perception of man being the giver and woman being the receiver, right? So as lesbians, as queer women don't even need men for sexual pleasure, right? So this idea of female being in charge of their lives, deciding for themselves, in a way wounds this phallocentric machismo, and it destroys the lives of women, and they get murdered, right? I was just wondering, like, I mean, of course you talked about it, but I was just thinking, like, do you think it's one of the reasons why Turkey withdrew from Istanbul Convention, despite it being so crucial for Turkish women, because they are able to make decisions for themselves and it's a very patriarchal, phallocentric society that we live in. As you mentioned, we live in a country called patriarchy and capitalism. So do you think that that is one of the reasons why Turkey withdrew from the convention?
I think I recently read something by an artist named Burak Delier, and I felt like it was such a concise analysis, but he talked about how there were micro power stages and micro power stages. And, you know, when you look at the government, when you look at it at the state level, it's a macro power stage. And, you know, with men at their homes, you know, wanting to be basically, I don't even know how to put this in a way that expresses my real feeling, but with men wanting to be the only decision maker and willing to murder someone if this is not the case. I think that's like a very big part of this. So it's the government's way of giving men a little bit of that micro power. It's like, here's your power vacuum and, you know, we'll look away, you can do anything. And one thing that's very important about the Istanbul Convention, which is, like I said, it's as important for the EU countries as it is for Turkey, is that it takes the domestic violence outside the house. It says that this is no longer a private matter, this is a public matter, and states have an obligation to stop this. So I think there is definitely like a huge answer there. It also signals to the society that this is unacceptable. Like you can no longer do this. So it is the most far-reaching and powerful legal instrument to date that was ever made to prevent violence against women. So, you know, up until, like I said, this decision to withdraw, the women in Turkey, our biggest fight was to make sure that it gets implemented, because it's the perfect legal structure. You just need to implement it.
Absolutely. No, absolutely. Thank you. Thank you for that. Continuing with that discussion, you mentioned in your presentation that, you know, when a murder is reported, it is often suggested that this man killed this woman in a fit of rage, right? And then they show up in suits and ties and get reduced sentences. I was thinking about this talk by one of the best writers and poets of our generation, Ocean Vuong, you know, how he deconstructs toxic masculinity, and he talks about how it's linked to violence. And he said, and I quote, that in this culture, we celebrate boys through the lexicon of violence. You know, we say, you're killing it, you're making a killing, smash them. And when they see themselves only worthwhile when they are capable of destroying things, it's inevitable that we arrive at a masculinity that is toxic, quote ended. How much connection do you see with these murders, the femicides in Turkey, related to the toxic masculinity and this lexicon of violence? I know you sort of talked about it a little bit, but do you have anything else you would like to add to that?
I mean, clearly a lot. And I think also, you know, it also still connects to the Istanbul Convention, because there are a lot of articles in it that wants to prevent this sort of behavior from the get-go. But, you know, the Turkish culture is very hypocritical when it comes to raising girls and boys, and there is like,
and I'm pretty sure that's the case with most of the cultures in the world, right? Like the way men are raised and the way women are raised.
Yeah, and I mean, the lexicon of violence is such a beautiful way to name, you know, such an awful thing, but there's definitely that, you know. And then I was also, what you were saying made me think of the language of media, which needs to change worldwide, because you will see this, like, basically the language of the patriarchy going everywhere, from, you know, shaping how people behave to
Absolutely.
making how people think, and to just think about that. Like, I think there are a few organizations in Turkey that made these pamphlets about how to ethically report on like rapes, murders, especially femicides, because it's the language in these papers you'll see is very yellow press, very kind of trying to like make you wonder what happened next, like this is unacceptable. So I think, you know, the lexicon of violence clearly needs to be eradicated.
Absolutely. No, I totally agree with you. And you raised a very interesting point about the language that we use to describe you know, issues like these, and even in the media. I mean, since I teach in journalism, and that's one of the things I always tell my students, the importance of language. Like, language matters, how you talk about people, it matters. And towards the end of your presentation, you raised the very interesting and important point, this idea of savior complex, right? When most of the times when we read reports of women getting murdered, there is this urge among, for the lack of a better word, Western countries, right, to rescue women and save them, especially if they're living in a Muslim majority country, right? Like Leila Abu Lagout, she wrote in her book titled "Do Muslim Women Need Saving?" She, in her book, challenges the savior complex of the West, right? We know that this problem of gender inequality, these conditions of misogyny and patriarchy, they are not unique to the Islamic world or to Muslim countries, right? Yet we see so many examples, especially also in the United States, like justifying military invasion and foreign interference in these countries in the name of rescuing oppressed women, especially oppressed Muslim women, while ignoring their own problems, right? Like you mentioned in your presentation. I'm just curious to know, have you seen any efforts by the West just to save Turkish women from this misogyny and patriarchy and these femicides that are happening in Turkey?
I think, you know, patriarchy is a cult of itself and needs no assistance from any other elements like race or religion, or, you know,
Absolutely.
it's like doing fine on its own, you know, destroying the world.
Absolutely.
But the savior point that I raised, it's actually, I was attending to even more lectures prior to my own, and I was listening to women who work on the field in Turkey. And
Right.
this was born of something that they said, because it was the Mor Çatı founders and volunteers who were talking about their stories. And they said,
Oh, wonderful.
you know, when we're working one-on-one with women, we make it very clear that, you know, we are suffering from the same problems that you are suffering from. Like, we're not here to save you. We're actually, we're helping each other out while we do this work. And I think that's a very right way to look at it. And then, you know, you look at cases like Sarah Everard, or, you know, you look at Latin America, which is, you know, Christian. And like, I mean, it's global South, but it's not, you know, it's not Middle East. So it's clearly like there's only one thread I feel that we're seeing. And I'm also thinking, I'm always like going back to media, I guess, but, you know, it's very much, to me, reminds me of like girl boss feminism, which is on the front is very kind of, oh, like, we're free and like we want everyone to be free. But when you look at like refinery 29s of the world, like that's where you're seeing, you know, like those who should be saved are actually like dealing with worse conditions than they would if they weren't being saved, you know?
Right, absolutely. No, and yeah, I mean, there are so many parallels that we can talk about, but I know we don't have much time, so I'm just gonna ask Abigail, Andy, and Cindy to tell us, if Sydney, if we have any questions that they can let us know from the participants.
I see that we do have a few now.
Okay.
Selena asks, how do you think all men as potential perpetrators, could be included in these important conversations on femicide, breaking stereotypes, gaslighting, issues of equality, because it seems that it is mostly women who are outraged?
This is a really good question. So one thing that I had found shocking when I first moved back to Turkey and went to the Women's March was that it was only women who were there. My boyfriend at the time was a journalist, and I asked him to come with me, and he was like, no, that's like women's space, that's the safe space, that's our way of respecting by not, entering there, like we're not allowed there. And I think I wish I saw more men speak up and post and read about what's going on, because there's definitely a very much lack of that. But then recently in Turkey, I feel there has been like a really amazing convergence with the student movement. It's like feminists, the LGBTQ community, and the students coming together. And you actually, the day after the Istanbul Convention was withdrawn, we saw like quite a few men on the streets walking alongside women. I think it's important that men come into this knowing that like they have to educate themselves. It's not like anyone's job to, educate them, and be just really, really good listeners until, until they feel like they can speak about like any of these issues. And then, but at the same time, I'd like to also mention that there are many men in Turkey whose mothers, whose sisters were, on the receiving end of violence. And you'll see there are some people who are very reactionary to this. And then from personal experience, I know that we all suffer from patriarchy. But yeah, I think it's important to make the space available and kind of be open to participation, but also, given everyone needs to move at their own pace. But yeah, I think it would be great to see more men speak up about these issues without mansplaining.
Really, yeah, absolutely. I mean, that was a very excellent point, that that men can be listeners. It's very important for them to come out as allies. They just have to be listening to our issues, women's issues, and then be better allies rather than mansplaining women and saying, let me tell you how you should go about it. Okay, do we have any other questions?
Yes, Kyungi Pyun, sorry if I mispronounced that, asked about the legal industry in Turkey. Are judges mostly men, or is the legal system sufficient but the social structures are inadequate?
That's another great question. Yes, the judges are mostly men. And I think most judges are mostly men. Like all power and money structures. And the judicial system question, I wish I had more expertise to answer on that, but from my personal experience, it looks hell of inadequate. But I don't know if I'm allowed to comment any further on that, because, but it's a judicial system, I feel, that works sometimes and doesn't work when it's not convenient to some people.
Do we have more questions?
There's one question in
Yes.
the chat. Can someone look at it, please?
Yeah, there's a question from Chelsea. I think it might touch on some of the same questions that Selena had asked, but it's asking, there's been a lot of conversations in the US about educating men about the ways patriarchy harms them just as much as it harms women, in hopes of encouraging men or encouraging them to become allies in the feminist movement. I'd love to know your thoughts on this, and do you think this is an effective / helpful to the feminist movement?
Yes, I mean, I think I'm trying to think like where to start. But yeah, I feel like, yeah, I mentioned this a few times, but I think, you know, some people are less susceptible to side effects of patriarchy and some are more. I was also thinking of this in terms of, you know, refugees in Turkey, because, you know, if like a Turkish woman in Turkey versus like a male refugee in Turkey, like who suffers more from patriarchy? It's I feel like it's an order that's like constantly moving, again, based on like convenience and you know, what the system wants to get out of the other person. But you know, I mean, even white men are susceptible to patriarchy, so it might, I don't think there's any harm in reminding them that you know, what the patriarchy expects of them and what the world would be like if we were to ever erase it.
Emma also asks, she's noting the conservative speculation around the convention, that it would undermine family structures and all of the controversial stuff you mentioned. She wants to know what the familial dynamics are like exactly. What is the role of the woman in the family, and if patriarchs have most, if not total, control of the home? And also, how do men and boys, how are they taught to treat the women in their lives? If you have any experience on that.
There are some scholars who are still alive and who write about this extensively. One of them is Deniz Kandiyoti. I'd advise looking up her work and how kind of the Turkish society changed and the family structure changed, especially in the like modern era and the, you know, in the times we live in. But from my personal experience, again, this isn't coming from a point of expertise, like I'm saying this as a narrator and a translator, but you know, the family structure is both, I would say, Mediterranean and Middle Eastern, where there is a patriarch, but I feel like we also have extremely powerful women, because like how else could you even exist in a system like this, you know? But boys definitely are raised with a certain privilege and they never forget about it, I can say.
Do we have more time for more questions? Emre, how much time do we have? Can we take more questions?
Jasmine, she might.
I think we can definitely take one or two more questions. I mean, some people may have other meetings and may need to go, but I think there are some great questions they're coming up through the chat as well as the Q&A. So if Abby, Andy, and Sydney, you can monitor both. Maybe two more questions and then we'll wrap up in about 10 minutes.
Perfect, thank you.
Yes, Nora Hatch asked, what are the steps that women and people in supportive countries like Turkey can do to help?
I'd once interviewed a documentary producer. She'd produced, no, not a documentary, but she'd produced the film with Angelina Jolie about a practice called Difret in Ethiopia. And her name is Mehret Menfrendu, if I'm not saying it incorrectly. But it wasn't until I spoke to her that I realized, you know, how much, like what the international awareness without the pretension can actually bring. Because while, you know, states are extremely solid and male-oriented, they also know that when someone is looking, they definitely know. So especially with like human rights issues, it's very important to know that, you know, someone's eye is on you. Someone that's, you know, I don't know even where, is posting a black and white photo of themselves asking you to implement the Istanbul Convention. So I've included a few links which Praveen will kindly send to FIT students after the class. And some of these are like civil society organizations, NGOs, and the others are like news sites. So I think it helps to follow, you know, a few platforms that announce things in English as well. And, you know, there are always campaigns, there are always, you know, the support can look like a lot of things. And I think, you know, if what you've, you know, learned more about today moved you, I think it's important to share it with people who, you know, will have the kind of same sensitivity going into it. It's hard to answer because, again, like it's really the border between the savior territory and the aware territory is extremely thin. But I think as long as like we are all self-aware, you know, it's always good to have witnesses and not bystanders.
And we have another question from Chelsea, who asked, you mentioned that men who sexually assault their children often go home back to them, leaving the children in extremely vulnerable and unsafe positions. Are there government agencies or laws to protect children in these circumstances? I guess the structural, yeah, the legal.
Technically there are, but they are the government, you know, the government and the social services. And to anyone who does their job perfectly, I'm, you know, eternally grateful to, apparently. But I think the current structure we have is very vulnerable to manipulation. And what happens in these cases, like when, you know, the father goes back to the home where he continues to abuse the children, is they make the child take back their complaint. And then they'll file a new lawsuit against the lawyer who's very often voluntarily like defending the child. And then, you know, they'll have the mother go back and give another testimony saying like, oh, we were all wrong about it. So it very much, you know, just sends the problem back to where it happens, like a very claustrophobic environment where you have no way of kind of escaping. So one important point to raise is with Istanbul Convention, it wouldn't be the same way because the convention protects children, even if they or their mother do not sue, B, even if they sue and take back their complaint, which is why it's crucial to have this in place.
I think we have time for one last question before we close the presentation.
Great. Veronica sent a question or two about the decapitation instance you mentioned, incredibly tragic. But is this, you mentioned it was the most common, are femicides in public common there? Is that something we see more often than not?
I meant that in the sense that femicides are most common when women are, after women have filed for a divorce and before the divorce is finalized. So it's an extremely, you know, high rate. And Souzeina knows this. I was hesitant to share the details of murders, but then it also felt like, you know, this is happening, and if, you know, if people are experiencing it, we have to talk about them.
I see one final question, and I think it's very important because towards the end of your presentation, you talked about that you have not found any hopeless feminist, right? And I see a question in the chat. Can anyone please read that? Because I feel it's so important, and we should end this talk on a hopeful note. So can anyone please read the question?
Sure. Are you speaking about, sorry, are you speaking about the question from Veronica, or from?
No, there is, after Veronica, there is a question from Tanu Priya.
Okay.
And
I see it. So she says that you mentioned that amidst all this darkness and the heartbreaking circumstances in and around this topic, you were never a hopeless feminist. How do you protect yourself while exposing yourself to such atrocious realities that fellow women go through with no remedy in sight?
Well, really, honestly, by through solidarity and coming together with more women and talking about what we can do and trying to change what we can change, and just with small acts every day, because you have to keep fighting, and you have to, we cannot, and I'm also like a mere observer, but like after meeting women who work out in the field and, we will stop femicides volunteers, it's unbelievable the amount of energy they have. There is this woman, I'll enter her name in this chat, but I'm a huge fan of hers. Her name is Fidan Ataselim, and you'll see her at each and every march and each and every trial. And what I said was that I never met a hopeless feminist, and I think I was about to become one before I started working on this presentation. But yeah, it's important that the only way out is true, and the only way true is together.
absolutely. Thank you so much, Busra, again. I'm just going to ask Professor Çelik Levine to say any
Yes.
closing remarks.
Thank you so much. I think I'm feeling, even though the presentation was really powerful and heartbreaking in so many ways, I'm feeling powerful and hopeful because we have scholars and activists and artists and journalists like Souzeina and like Busra who are bringing these to us and educating us. Earlier somebody asked a question about what can the outside world do about this? And my answer to that question always is keep abreast of what's happening in the world and be an ally and be educated about these things. So Busra, thank you so much. This was really an amazing presentation, and I'm so glad we had such a good turnout. And Souzeina, you always do such a wonderful job moderating. I think you should moderate all our events. So thank you so much to also Abigail, Sydney, and Andy for moderating the chat, and to Dean Patrick Knisley, the Dean of the School of Liberal Arts, who really made this possible. Of course, Professor Chaudhry, Professor Ostos, thank you everybody for making this possible. It was really fabulous. Thank you, everybody.